broad-based alliances are necessary for broad-based change. Number three, and I'm the chair of Oxfam, as he said, we like to think, big international NGOs, that we're going to help deliver change in countries we're working in. Sorry, INGOs who are present, in none of these cases did the leadership come or the initiative come from the international NGOs. In every one, it emerged from deeply rooted national formations of civil society actors, led by people who had deep experience in those societies. INGOs, international NGOs, played a very important supportive role, but they didn't create the movements, they supported them. Every one of these took a slightly different approach to how they framed the issue from the local to the global. This is really important because you're dealing with disaster risk reduction. You're dealing with a whole new set of vocabulary that sort of, I don't know where it came from, sort of percolated up here somewhere. And you're having to convince people and bring people along. But is that the best framing to use risk reduction and prevention and so on? Or is there another way to frame that uses local discourse and local understandings? In some cases, linking to the international framing gave people space. In other places, it was seen as outside intervention, and they found other ways of communicating with people around their own sets of meanings. And finally, this question of contentious politics is necessary for contentious change. That is, these days a lot of civil society participation is simply consultation in a meeting room. Sometimes that solves things, but where we're dealing with fundamental issues of power, it's taken more than that. It's taken mobilization in the streets, it's taken direct forms of action, other kinds of things that some civil society needs to keep in its vocabulary as well. Now, I'll just end on this next one, because I think this is maybe very important to what I heard you talking about earlier. As I said, we began this study by saying, let's find out the successful cases and see how they got that success. Okay? But the more we looked at it, the more we realized that a lot depended on how you define success. How will you know when you have been successful in bringing citizen voices to the policy arena? So one approach is to focus, I don't quite like these words, but I don't have better ones, is to focus on the policy framework. We were successful because by bringing citizen voices in, we actually changed the law about climate change, or DRR, at the national or local level. We got better implementation. Well, already that's important. There's no point in changing a law if you can't get implementation. And that actually led to improvement on people's lives. Well, that'd be fantastic if you can do that. But in these case studies, those that took more of a professional policy advocacy point of view were pretty good at bringing about change here. But then when the change happened, they moved on to the next campaign. And then what happened? The change disappeared. Why? Because there were no people involved in the process of change who could sustain the victory over time. So a broader sense of definition is no. Our involvement of changing policy is not simply changing what the policy is, but it's changing who makes policy in this country. It's changing the patterns of decision making. It's changing the culture of accountability. It's not just getting better government implementation, but it's empowering citizens who have the capability to keep that government to account. It's not just changing the tangible material sense of well-being or whatever, or better budgets for disaster risk reduction. It's actually having a sense of citizenship and empowered citizens who can continue to monitor those policies after you're gone. So what we found in the studies is that the deeper the civil society campaign, that is, the more that it went from here to here, the more sustainable it was. So I think we have to, when we talk about policy advocacy, we have to move out of this little box and look at the whole process of change if we're going to create sustainable change. Okay, I'm sorry, I've gone too long already. That's covering a lot. We tried to talk about what do you really mean by putting the voice of vulnerable people in the policy process. What do we mean by participation? And where in that policy cycle do you see as the entry points in your work? And what do you mean by success in the end? So I think maybe we could take a few minutes at each table just to buzz around these questions. What strategies are you using to put the voices of vulnerable people at the heart of DRR policy? What are the tensions and trade-offs? If you do one, it's hard to do the other. What are the tensions and trade-offs across these? And this last question I particularly want to hear back from you after a few minutes of discussion. What does success look like to you? If you're able to do this, when you're meeting here 3 years from now, or whenever it is, and you've gone beyond the monitoring to do other forms of other forms of citizen engagement, what's success going to look like at that time? Okay, so you want to spend 10-15 minutes just buzzing around those questions at your tables, and then we'll get some feedback and questions. Any questions for me about just clarity at this stage before we... Yes, please.
Just an example, John, thank you, of the trade-off. Thank you, John. If you could just give us an example of the trade-offs, that would be helpful, just to get us going.
Well, one I think is the last one that I was talking about. I suspect that you all working at national level, this DRR business, this climate change business, it's a complicated policy. And you're probably, as it emerges, you're being called upon all the time to leap into us, to go discuss, consult with national policies. The trade-off between being quick and efficient and professional and being able to talk the language of the decision makers because you know how, versus bringing people along with you and doing long-term awareness and strengthening their voice so they're speaking directly and don't need you along the way. That would be one example of a trade-off. A trade-off between change at the local level or the global level, but we'll come back to that afterwards. A trade-off between, are we trying to monitor here at the end, or are we trying to do we need to step back and put more attention in whose voices go into the process, not just what happens coming out of the process. Those kinds of things. Okay? Yeah, please.
Sorry, John. It's a question not directly related to the table questions, but more related to your presentation in general.
Okay.
I work for a national NGO in Thailand, and one problem we see very often is that even though there is maybe some quite good participation in terms of citizens influencing policy, but once the policy changes, for various reasons, action at the field level doesn't necessarily change in line with that policy. So sometimes the policy is very good, but the local level implementation doesn't change accordingly. I wonder if you have any comments or helpful suggestions in that area.
Yeah, that's where I do think this cycle becomes very important, right? Because you can get a change of policy here, but getting that implementation, making sure it's being implemented and changes happening on the ground is absolutely critical. So for me, it's about what happens goes into the policy process and how you bring it back to people, and in certain circumstances it becomes a virtual circle. That is, that the more people see that there's some accountability to them, the more likely they are to mobilize and get involved. And so when this begins to happen, it can really take off. But more often what happens is people see a change at one level and focus all their energies there, and we don't go follow all the way through the cycle, and then it doesn't translate to change on the ground and to sustainable change.